Jay Baba, thanks for coming. Good to see everybody. Okay, so this is talk 10, and there'll be one more talk. That'll be the conclusion next week. But before we begin today's talk, we're going to have a little preamble because I had expressed an idea last week. I had said something kind of cursorily, or kind of quickly, and it's that everything is describable in number. This was a belief of Pythagoras, who was a philosopher and a mystic in ancient Italy, actually, but was part of the Greek Empire. And also Newton said that, and it's in the Old Testament. Everything is, God made everything with number. This is, I think, it's a recurring theme. Now, when we say that, going over a few examples, the shape of something is describable in number. It's describable in ratios of space, height to width, and then you keep reducing that down, and you do some calculus, and you get the volume and all that. And of course, and then the natural laws of nature, they are all reducible to ratios of time and space. So to give a couple examples, the speed of light is 186,000 miles a second. The miles is a quantity of space that it traverses, and the second is a duration of time. So it's a ratio between time and space. And the same with gravity. If I drop a rock, it'll fall 30 feet per second until it reaches terminal velocity, and that's a ratio of time and space. And so, last week I laid out the idea that I'd had 20 years ago and written 14 years ago, and that's the idea that we have perception. This doesn't represent an I, it represents conscious perceiving. And we start out without a subject or object. We start out with simply the perceiving, what occurs between a subject and object. That's what I believe existed right after the beginning of time, and we'll look at that later again. But anyway, this perception has the power of imagining ways of perceiving, and so these are natural laws. They're the laws of nature are actually, I believe, laws of perception. There's no reason to think otherwise. If I drop a rock, there seems to be a law that every time you see me drop a rock, you'll see it fall. So then I said that our bodies are made of natural laws. They're reducible or describable in terms of natural laws. And through them we evolve sense data, a sense apparatus like nerves and brains, which then through another algorithm and set of lenses that we have, changes that number into color and sound, and then that we have our world. I'll go over that again. But the important thing is I wanted to demonstrate, since that's a little hard to get your head around, that everything that we perceive can be reduced to number. So we start now with a guy named Dan, who's an invented character, and he skips a pebble over a stream. And everything about this event is describable in terms of number. For instance, Dan picks up one rock, which is describable in number, and has weight and mass and volume that are described in number, and its geometry, I forgot to mention, is describable, as I said, in terms of number, so its shape. And everything about the event, even where it's going to land on the other side of the stream, can all be determined by laws of nature and describable in number. Now, that's an ancient belief, as I said, that what underlies the phenomenal world is number. This is an old idea. Well, young people, I said, younger generations, have an advantage over the rest of us in a way, that this is very easy to understand because they play computer games. And there's a game called Skyrim, which I'm just going to show a low promo of so you can see how it works. And it works by algorithms. Just if you capture that slide, somebody interested can read the whole thing. We don't need to because we need to move on. So a young person understands, and most of us do, that the computer that he plays this game that we're about to look at doesn't have anything like that picture in it. It doesn't have any pictures or sounds on its chip. It only has number, and it's impressed and embossed onto the silicon chip. And it runs by algorithms, which are essentially laws. They're just like laws. If this happens, then this will happen. If this is, okay, if this state occurs, then produce this state. It does this, that's how it does it. So it kind of has laws of its own. Now, we're gonna watch this video to see what we get from just number. Okay. And here we go.
Welcome back to Skyrim Mod Comparisons. So in this video we're going to be looking at mods that basically change how the first person viewer looks to make it more immersive. So the two mods are Enhanced Camera and Immersive First Person View. I will mention that Enhanced Camera is very new, so there's a lot of bugs, but the mod author is currently still trying to fix all the bugs and add new features. So when you install this mod it works straight away. All it requires is SKSE. You don't even need SkyUI if you want to run it. There's no MCM menu, and when you look down you can see your character's body. As you can see, there's a bit of clipping going on, but that will be fixed in the future. So when you start running around you can see that the animations are very good, and you can see how much work's been put into this mod. But it's not just running and walking you get animations for, you get them for almost everything. So as you can see here, it's a first person animation for when you're using the grindstone, and for basically everything else, which is really, really cool and immersive, and definitely adds to the crafting to make it a little bit less boring. You can get animations when you sit down, so you can sit down in first person rather than when the vanilla game forces you into third person. And it's also the same with a horse. When you get on a horse in the vanilla game, you're forced into third person, but with this mod you can go into first person, and now you can actually see yourself on the horse. And actually it cured a huge problem for me when I ran around with a horse around by Whiterun. I was getting huge lag spikes in third person. But with this mod I don't get any lag spikes in first person on a horse. It's the same for combat, it's now a lot easier. I always found fighting with a bow on the back of a horse in third person quite complicated and difficult because you can't really see where you're aiming. But with first person it's absolutely perfect, and you can actually see where you're aiming and hit people for once. Now of all the features, my number one feature will have to be the death animation. Normally when you fall, again you get put into third person, but not anymore. If when you accidentally press the wrong button because you thought you had Fusroda equipped and you fall off the edge of a cliff like I just did, as you can see it is in first person, which is really cool, especially when you're going for those jumps off the top of the throat of the world. You can just see yourself tumbling down, and it is really cool. And I also forgot to mention there's also a new swimming animation, but at the moment when you look down, if you're using something like Wet and Cold, you can't see the drips. So I'd suggest to the mod author to try and include things like that, all immersive mods like Wet and Cold, which would be the icing on the cake for this mod for me. So now we'll move on to immersive first person.
Cool.
Yeah, thank you.
That was fun.
So back to our slideshow.
They have stuff like that at Disneyland, and you wear 3D glasses.
Right, and I'm sure they produce it the same way with mathematical algorithms. An algorithm just means if this happens, then always this must happen. Okay, which is so.
Is that what virtual reality kind of?
That's called virtual reality. Thank you. Now, what's behind all this is this. These kinds of numbers. These are positive and negative charges. It's what they represent, so that it can reproduce this physically. And this is a bit that represents 38, and I just explained what an algorithm is. Okay. Now we'll begin Talk 10. Talk 10 is where intuition comes up for the first time, but in a very special sense, in a philosophical sense, not a poetic sense so much. Except, to me, because I love poetry, it's all poetic. I do feel poetry in it. So, this picture is from Stay with God, the book by Francis Brabazon, written in 1959. And the drawing is by John Parry. Ooh, the projector got moved again. Thank you. Oh, wonderful. And I like the picture because it kind of represents intuition to me, the light. Now, what an intuition is there's something that you know with absolute certainty that can't be wrong, but you don't know how you know, and everyone will agree with you, because the kind of intuition I'm talking about is something that we share. It's not like you have to go find an intuitive. We all have these. Even people with problems like they're on the spectrum of autism. Yeah, they even have these intuitions. So, and now what we're going to talk about today is the proof that this order of lenses has to be true. Okay? Originally, 14 years ago, when I wrote my book, I really didn't think there was any way I could know this, so I called it a theory. The name of the book is The Evolution of Perception and the Cosmology of Substance, which means the forming of substance out of perception. A simpler theory of everything. But a few months ago, I realized, working on my book, that there was a way that we can know something with absolute certainty, and it happens to be about cause. Now, the first line is from Stay with God, another reason that the book is on the front. Go back from effect to cause until you are compelled to believe. Compelled to believe in God. Okay? And this is a line by Baba. The hour is near when man in his eager longing for real happiness will seek its true source. He also mentions that our material conceptions are futile. That's interesting. Now, I'm going to review last week, and the 3 people here were not here last week, so they'll be helpful. We introduced an idea, as I sort of described here, where we have the evolution of the laws of nature which give rise to our physical bodies, which then, as they evolve better and better brains and nervous systems that are able, and through them, through the body, which is actually mathematical, we add to that mathematical data the color, the sound, the flavor, the fragrance, okay? But we have to have a body to do that, okay? And Meher Baba makes a big thing about the need for a body, okay? Now, and then the image world, or phenomena is anything you can experience. It emerges out of this process, and in a sense, it's kind of cool. We're sort of co-creators with God of the universe, except that there's really all just one seer behind everything. There's one soul. But we won't get into details, okay? About why there's a sense in which we have individuality, because Baba talks about that. But it supervenes in the process. Okay. This is a quote by Baba, which says what I just said, no, it's not a quote by Meher Baba. I'm sorry. It's a quote by the editors of Amazon.com, which is Sufism Reoriented, I assume. It's on the editors of God Speaks. And you find that on Amazon. And a friend of mine and I, Stelios Karvaias, we noticed 12 years ago that it was really well written. And luckily it's still there. And it so well captures God Speaks. And it has a couple lines about God Speaks in it that are like we've been saying. The only protagonist is God, and that it is God himself who becomes the three basic processes. And I talked last week that we're no longer talking about a thing causing things. I said that's never worked in history, and so we have to look for a process. And we need to look for a process of perception. That's where, by the title of my original book, The Evolution of Perception. Bobby uses the word evolution of consciousness, but that's part of this. There's no such thing as perception that's not conscious perception. Okay. Now, I'm just going to go over very roughly the thing. There, we kind of have the unity behind the diversity. And we have ourselves, we have our own impressions. These natural laws are like the impressions of a state of God. And that state of God is actually in God Speaks. I can point to it, but I can't remember right now. And then we add impressions like, poor people are disgusting and rich people are really honorable, and all kinds of things we gather from our training and our experience, and we gain prejudices, and so we add all that to there. We also add the color and the sound and the smell and the taste. Now this chart is the whole thing, and I looked it over carefully, and it's quite good still. I did this 14 years ago, but it's still quite good. Imagination, active but without organization, and then imagination creates the schema of time, and then space, and then out of the time and space, of course, the natural laws are ratios of time and space, and you get these laws, and then it produces the biological forms, form out of them, and then we see through them, and then you have cultural evolution, and we add all these, and then myths, and then we get our whole, not only the color, the sound, the taste, but we also get all of our judgments, and we see meaning in it all, based on our mythologies, the way we frame our world, which is also lenses. Okay, so that produces the percept. So the percept is the result of this lengthy process. And then to sum up, God is projecting the universe. And I talked last week how whether we use an eye, whether we use a projector, it doesn't matter, because there's a sense in which we do project much of what we then that we see, and that's what I believe is really occurring. We are both projecting, God is projecting half of it, we're projecting the rest. We're in God, He's projecting us too. It's sort of like emerging lenses out of lenses. Now, the laws of nature are laws of perception. Because that's all we have access to is perception. What else would they be laws of? They begin with God's impressions, and the rest are impressions in the individual that form out of the first. Baba referred to the world as a dream within a dream. And you get that sense in which you're having a dream that's within a larger dream. So you're the dreamer within the dreamer. Now I want to point out some things to notice, and notice how we don't here fall into solipsism or relativism. Solipsism is, it's all in your head. So as we see, it's certainly not, let's say this is somebody, and the world does not all exist in his head. It's not all his own projection of his own ego. There's an objective aspect that is being projected here too. You've got qualities that are objective, and you've got qualities that are contributed, which are subjective. So we don't fall into relativism or solipsism, which are problems these days. Relativism is a problem these days. Nor did we create a hypostasis to save objectivity. last week and throughout for the last couple of months, I've been explaining that the way to save an objective world is they always projected an imaginary substance, some kind of substratum or something that they can't see, and somehow it's making the world. But it never worked because they never explained how it could produce your experience. So it was the only way they knew how to think. The only way they knew how to think was to invent another thing, like the things they see. So here we don't do that. Here we achieve objectivity and subjectivity, which both exist, without hypothesizing some kind of unprovable entity. We don't start with entities at all. Entities end up being the effect, not the cause. And to note that there are not in this two worlds. We don't have a dualism. We don't have, like in the Matrix, where there's the real world that Neo sees when he takes the red pill, and then the other world of his experience. There's just one. The world of experience is the world. So that's important. Because it's very unintuitive that we're not experiencing the world. And Baba says on page 3 of God Speaks that we experience, a gross conscious person experiences the gross world. He didn't say a gross conscious person experiences representation of another world. He's just said you experience the gross world. The gross world supervenes upon perception itself, so therefore you are directly seeing the actual object. There are two senses of real. One, it means most fundamentally real. If that's what we mean by real, it's perception. But there's another sense of the word real, which is a simpler, colloquial, often used word, which differentiates something from a toy one, or a fake, okay, or a representation. It's the real original one. And in that sense, we are seeing the real world. Not a fake world, the real one, okay? But we're not seeing reality, we're seeing illusion. But it's the real illusion, okay? So, see, there is really only one soul seeing through every individual soul. There is only one seer, but many percept. Judy has her experience, I have my experience, but they are experience of this one world that's being projected also. See that God does not fall into the influence of any dividing lens. Now, all lenses cause division, okay? They're like ratios, number. And some of these lenses produce, of course, division between rich and poor, tall and short, good and bad, And here it is. I wanted to explain this. I'm going to go over this again, but I brought this to help. This is a lens, okay? And I can look through that, and it makes things rosy. Guys, looking through a tinted rose-colored glass. Now, I'm looking through that, and just take my word for it. Y'all look real rosy, okay? Everything looks rosy to me, because this is conditioning my lens. And it's basically subtracting a lot, and what I'm getting is just rosiness. So I see that way. But I'm not rosy, okay? So the real seer, the oversoul, the soul behind every soul, is not conditioned by any of these lenses. It is not limited by any of them. So if this lens is time, God is not in time. God is producing time. So that which is producing and imagining the lenses does not fall under the scope of the lenses he produces. This is the sense in which he remains eternally free, eternally undifferentiated, formless. Because these produce form. They don't produce form for the seer, the seeing. So, okay. Now, these are just two quotes by Baba, not by Sufism oriented. Okay, so these are by Baba, and I'll read them. The you is a sort of alter ego or another self within the self. And that's from Beams. And the other is from the Everything and the Nothing. Baba basically wrote 4 books. The God Speaks, the Discourses, Beams, and the Everything and the Nothing. There's just 4 books. These are the short ones. And your life is a dream within the mighty dream of God, which is the universe. So we're a dream within it, which is captured through this way of looking. Now, I used to believe that there was no way, as I explained before, that we can know anything. And I really was looking hard. But I looked at all the forms that we know something called epistemology. That's how do you know something? Epistemological questions or questions of how do you know? And what do you really know? And we only have 2 forms of logic called deduction and induction. And we have perception, and they don't tell us anything, as you were here for that talk, because they don't tell us anything we didn't already presume. So they don't tell us anything. All they can do, all deductive logic can do is keep us consistent with our assumptions, whether they're right or wrong. So they're never going to teach us anything. And then inductive logic is just the assumption that the future will be kind of like the past. So, you know, every time I lend John $5, he never pays it back, so I induce that it's a pattern and I'm not going to do it again. That's all that is. It's very iffy because he might pay you back. So we can't learn anything about cause in these ways. So perception is not only inaccurate, but perception could never show you the cause. When I drop a rock, you just see it fall. It's the effect, but you don't see the cause. So perception won't help us. And that was the sum of it. So I felt back then that the only way we could do, because I was already guessing this kind of stuff then, and I thought, well, the only way I'm doing this is because I've been, you know, known about Baba since I was 4 years old, and I started reading God Speaks when I was a teenager. And so we get it from Scripture. We have to get it from Scripture, because I couldn't see it. How else? Okay? However, where was I getting these ideas? Okay, what kind of a method or mode of epistemology was I using? Okay, it wasn't just intuition, because lots of intuitive people, they weren't getting this. So I now know what it is. I know what it is. Okay, it is an intuition that we never knew we had. We all have it, but it's going to be difficult at first. But I believe that this is for the future. I believe that people are going to get this and use this. Okay. All right. Intuition. So I already defined intuition as you know something is true, you know it with absolute certainty, and you don't know how you know. So we call it intuition. That's its technical use. In mathematics, they use the word a lot. And they mean it just like that. So we know that 1 + 1 is 2, and that it'll be 2 tomorrow. But how do we know it's going to be 2 tomorrow? We can't see tomorrow. They can't prove it mathematically. It's an these things are axioms. Axiom is something that you take for granted, and you use it to prove other things. So we have no way to know that 1 + 1 is 2. So they call it an intuition. Okay. Now, some talks back, I talked in one talk, I think it was number 5, I talked about Socrates and Aristotle, who are very important at the beginning of our Western tradition. And both of them introduced certain ideas, which seemed, and they seemed like they taught us something new. Let's go over what they taught us, and you'll see that they weren't. They were pointing out an intuition that people didn't know they were using. Okay, the first one is, if you remember Socrates, when I talked about him, it was from 2 dialogues by Plato, where Socrates always plays the protagonist in the dialogues of Plato. And the first was where he was making people aware that they had abstract ideas. Like, people would talk about courage. He shows a lot of courage. I want to teach courage to my children. And then, but Socrates says, well, first of all, we need to figure out what courage is. because if you're going to teach them, you got to know what it is you're teaching to be able to discern what's courage and what's not, because maybe it's not courage. Now, what he was pointing at was that they were looking at particulars, acts, and they were sort of seeing them as courageous or not courageous, but he was saying, no, there's an abstract idea here. It's kind of like there's a lens you're looking through, okay? And we get that today, but people didn't get that before. But he wasn't teaching them anything. They were already using abstract ideas. They just didn't know that's what they were. Now, the other things he taught us, they were innate ideas, and I'm going to show that in a moment. He took the slave of a person, and he showed that he knew geometry, and without him ever being taught. And now, Aristotle taught the first rudimentary, it was the logic that existed right up to the end of the Middle Ages. No, later than that. Logic only got developed really in the late 19th century and the 20th century. But they always had, and what he taught was those algorithms like, if all boys, I don't need to write it, if all boys can fly, Johnny is a boy, Johnny can fly. We're already doing that. Everybody was using logic anyway. He just formalized it, made rules, and called it syllogisms. Okay? And it's syllogistic logic. He wasn't teaching them to do something, and I already said that. Well, maybe I didn't. Behind logic is just intuition. The intuition of non-contradiction. When you contradict yourself, you just know something's wrong. That's not provable, it's an axiom. Okay? It's not provable that things can't contradict, it's intuitive. So these people were actually pointing to intuitions, but nobody has really recognized that. Instead, okay, now Socrates himself said that the teacher does not teach, but awakens knowledge within the student. So that he was more aware of this than Aristotle was. He's much more internal. Now this is the story about Meno's slave. Meno was an aristocrat in Greece, and he came over to talk to Socrates. Socrates wanted to demonstrate something, and he drew a diagram and the sand, and he asked the slave boy who had no education to come, and he very carefully laid out the problem. Now these guys were all scholars. They all were scholars in geometry. That was just what men did in Athens in 400 BC. They felt that it prepared your mind. But this guy had no education, but he answered the question. Socrates, you see? I'm not teaching. I'm just reminding. This is where Plato got the idea, finally, of his forms, trying to figure out, well, where did we get these? And so he had ideas. Okay. And this is a quote by Baba from the Discourses. It says the same thing that Socrates did. Okay. The contribution of the master consists in confirming and consolidating the previously acquired intuitions and perceptions of the aspirant. He's not really teaching us. He's awakening us to what we already really have within us, latently. This, again, I just do this because so we can see the intuition behind logic. So this is logic. There's a premise. The age of a person denotes how many years that person was born. How many years ago that person was born? Davy is 8 years old. How many years ago was Davy born? That's really funny. 8. Well, we know the answer is 8 by intuition. Because our intuition tells us that contradiction would be wrong. But you can't prove that contradiction would be wrong, actually. That's funny. You use it to make proofs, but you don't actually prove that contradiction is impossible. It just seems like it could be possible. But we have this intuition, it's not. Stay consistent. So logic merely codifies our intuition. That's why a 5-year-old can answer the question. That's why when I asked my daughter if all boys had had wings, and Johnny was a boy, but Johnny had wings. And actually, she was like, she was about 5 years old. And I was with another, an academic, and we both were marveling, and because we had repeated the experiment of Socrates, we felt pretty good. And Megan was really proud. She always very confident that, I understand logic. I understand logic very well. I don't really need to be taught anymore. And she's right. We're all logical. Okay. Before we can see our innate intuition regarding causation, we must recognize what we have been learning for the last 9 weeks, recognizing for the last 9 weeks. And that is that the only thing to explain is our ability to perceive as we do. This idea of these theoretical objects that never did anything except added to the sum of things to explain taught us that all there is to explain is experience. All there is experience. To experience. And I pointed out that even the planes are experiences. Heaven and hell state, Baba says, are states of experience. They're not places. Okay? So we must recognize flat out that we are in the realm of psychology. Okay? Not theory. I don't know. That's probably the wrong word. Yeah, not theory about hypostatized theoretical entities. That's what I meant. Theoretical entities. We're in the realm of psychology. Psychology is in the broad sense, because we're talking about mind, we're talking about perception. These are psychological, and we're not talking about anything else. Nobody really knew that before. Nobody recognized. I've actually read, they say, a lot of philosophers, what they're doing is really psychology. It's not philosophy. So there's this real hard-nosed thing that psychology is over there. It's very unscientific. And that's not what we do. But actually here, at this point, we're just flat out admitting that's what we're doing. And the great thing is, while we don't have any access to those theoretical things we invented, and so we can't see or observe or test or compare to anything, we do have direct access to our own minds. They're intimately familiar. Perception is something, there's nothing more intimate than your own perceiving, because that's what we're doing. That's what we are. So we're looking now different. And that's why there could be an intuition there. We have intuitions about how perception works. We just didn't realize it because we've been looking in all the wrong places. Okay? So we're starting over. We're in like a whole new territory. Everything has to be rewritten. Note that the things I explain will seem strangely familiar, as if you always knew them. And I'm merely pointing them out. Now that's not going to be perfect. That's not going to be, because it's new, so it's going to seem strange. It might even be like it goes over your head. And you go, I don't know, I don't have that intuition. No, you do. It just takes time to focus on it. And that's why these films are so important to me for these young kids in the future who will have the time and to really look at this if they want to. We're old. Okay, so here's some dominoes, okay? And dominoes, as we all know, if you push one domino, the domino's going to fall in. And this has created a kind of a meme or an idea that we have that there's what's called causal chains. And that picture is called a Rube Goldberg machine. It was a guy named Rube Goldberg in the 1930s, and he had a cartoon strip, and he would do these funny inventions. And they were like causal chains, okay? But there's a problem in causal chains. The philosopher that pointed this out to me, it was Hansen, who I talked about either the last time or the time before. And Hansen talked a lot about perception and cause. And I got a lot from Hansen. He said this idea of causal chains is kind of absurd. I don't know how much I can go into it because of time, but I want to. Which event in the chain of so-called causes, the so-called causal chain, is truly responsible for the final outcome? So let's say I had a table here and I had a bunch of dominoes and they're all laid out. Now, I push the first domino and it hits another domino, causes another domino to fall. That's how, this is colloquially how we speak. And then it hits another, causes another domino to fall. And then finally, They're all down. So what caused the last domino? Well, first answer might be, well, the second to the last domino caused it to fall. Yeah, but it didn't have any choice. It wasn't really responsible because the third domino back was responsible for it falling. So you can't really call it the cause. See, there's sort of there's two senses of cause. One is like, her talking caused me a headache. But there's another sense in which we really mean the real cause, which means what is really responsible. That which is responsible. Bob uses this word, responsible. So imagine we're in a morgue, and there's this guy, and the body is wheeled in, and everybody's standing around the body. There's a social worker there, there's a psychiatrist there, there's the mortician is there, and the police officer is there. They're all standing there. Now, the mortician says the disruption of this layer of the heart caused the death. Then the cop says, well, it was a 38 caliber that caused the death, or this criminal caused the death. And then the social worker says, well, it's social problems, societal problems. And then some psychiatrist says it's actually a defect in this person that did the murder. It was really his parents that caused him to be that way. It wasn't really his fault. And a ballistics expert would say this bullet here caused it. So everybody's got a different cause. So now these are all going backward. Now, so where's this chain? It's more looking like an octopus. It's going back because each one of those things has in turn causes, okay, so-called. So, for instance, when I pushed the first domino, something caused me to do that, okay? Well, you got a lot of physical stuff that caused it, which is reducible to laws of nature, okay? But you also have psychological reasons why I did that. I chose to do that because I thought it would be funny, and I'm a humorous guy. But what caused me to be a funny guy? Well, then this happened when I was a kid, and I got this thing, or in a previous life or something. But what caused that? And what caused that? And what caused that? Well, that's going to lead back to psychological laws, which can't be explained. We can't explain why when you see certain things when you're a child, it causes you to become funny. Whereas on the other hand, your sister, she became a sourpuss. So she was with the same parent. We don't know those psychological, but notice that both are leading back to laws, okay? Whether it's the physical that you're examining, it's going to lead back to laws. The bullet, weight, its speed, every one of those things is going to lead back to physical laws or psychological laws. There's just two kinds, mental and physical. But no one can explain those. No one can explain laws. So whoever caused the laws is really responsible. It's really responsible for the guy's death. Not the guy's mother, not the guy, not the bullet. It's whatever caused those laws, that then it had to happen by law, by those laws. Now, skip that picture, that's too much. So, what we thought was a string of causes then is in fact a string of effects of that one event that is responsible. The string of effects will lead us back to the one responsible end if we go backward. Okay, we're going to back up, okay, which alone can be called the cause, whatever is really responsible. Now, in order to be responsible, that can't be caused by something. Okay. So it can't be because somebody made it do that. So there's got to be one free event in the very beginning. But it's not Aristotle's unmoved mover, because it's not a thing. The above idea moves the subject of cause squarely into the realm of psychology. I've already said that. And it is here that our intuitions shine, for we are intimate with our own minds. And that I've already said. Now, I'm going to show you something. And you're going to see your intuition work now, okay? Imagine Julius Caesar. He's sitting at his desk in his palace. Because he had to go over his notes and stuff, you know. We always picture him standing there holding a spear, but he really had a lot of desk work. And there's a little table by his desk, okay? And then one day, a computer appears on that desk, magically. Doesn't matter, it's an analogy. It's a parable, it's an allegory. It's like Plato's cave. In Plato's cave, everybody's tied up. The slaves are tied, and they've been there since birth, and they know nothing but the shadows on the back of the wall. Well, that's impossible that they could have been there. It doesn't matter. That's not what the story's about. We don't need to find a hole in the logic. We just need to look. Okay. Then it appears. Now, let us imagine that Julius Caesar, he calls in all his court philosophers. That's what the scientists of the day were called. And he said, and they had, you know, levers, and they had bellows, and they had windmills, and they had things. They understood machines. And he said, I don't know what this is, but I feel that the gods have put it here for a reason. And there's something they want me to do with this. So what I want you all to do is I want you to all take this into your laboratories, and I want you to figure out what it does, what it's for, and duplicate it and make it work as it's intended. So, what would be the problem? It's impossible. Why is it impossible? Because there are a series of steps that are cognitive that had to happen first, and you can't miss them. For instance, how is it, first of all, there's plastics in it. They didn't have even the ideas of plastics. They made out of oil. That kind of thinking wasn't there. So they couldn't have even guessed what it was made of. Or they didn't have clear glass. They didn't have, so that's physically, they didn't have those things. But mentally, they really didn't, because I'll tell you why we have computers. Starting in the 1800s, some Germans started working on mathematics deep for the first time. It had been sort of dormant since the Middle Ages. And then at the turn of the century, Bertrand Russell, with another philosopher, Whitehead, they did a book called Mathematica Principia, and that went deeper into mathematics and logic than had ever happened before. Far. It's a classic, okay? It jumped the world forward in understanding math and logic by leaps and bounds. Their project, their motive for doing it ended up being fruitless. But because of that, we had this excitement in logic and in mathematics. And then that developed, and they developed through the 20th century other modes of logic, one called modal logic that has to do with possibilities. Okay? And this math that was now understood by mankind made it possible to program those computers. Okay? So there is no way that those philosophers of Julius Caesar could determine that, because they had not passed through the steps of lenses, of ways of looking at seeing things and seeing all these dimensions. They can't see them. It's not that they couldn't if they were taught from childhood or something. They'd have to time travel to the 21st century. So that can't exist because the mind hadn't evolved. In other words, their minds were just like ours. They were just fine, but they didn't have this that then supervenes into this, that then supervenes into this. A computer in Caesar's office, however, violates no law of logic. It's totally, there's no law of contradiction that it breaks. But we know, I just explained why it can't have occurred. But logic could never have told us this. Now, nor does it violate any law of physics. All the atoms were there that necessary to make the glass and the thing, and it could have appeared. Okay? Just, I mean, it could have been there. There's nothing physically to prevent it from existing there. Okay? So what it violates is something we intuitively know, but never realized we knew. There is a certain order in which schemas must arise cognitively. See, when I wrote my book, over here, if you can get this. When I wrote my book, I was honest, and I said, well, this works, but I just sort of played around, it feels like, and then I got something to work. But the order of these lenses, and it's in my first book 14 years ago, I said it's ad hoc. That means there's nothing necessary about it, it seemed to me. It just seemed like, you can play with it and get it to work, but somehow I got it to work. Today I know that's not true. Today I know I was using something. And there's actually, turns out, I learned from Hansen, there's a third kind of logic. And no one understands it. It's mysterious. It's called retroduction. You know that there's induction and there's deduction, and this is called retroduction. This is where some people seem to have the ability, like Isaac Newton is an example, that they seem to be able to guess something that was a necessary precondition of something happening. And that's how we got gravity. But we all have that. It's just that nobody got taught to do this. But now, there are necessary preconditions for knowledge and awareness of something. When any necessary precondition is missing, we instantly recognize there is some logical anachronism, although we can't explain how we know. It's in it. An anachronism is a thing belonging to a period other than in which it could exist. So a perception that couldn't be there because the other lenses weren't there. So I'm going to show you where this occurs over here. There are necessary preconditions before something can be realized and recognized. One step must come before the other, and no step can be missing. Understanding the purpose and function of a computer is impossible, which I've already explained. The cognitive conditions were not there. We never recognized we had, well, no, that's good enough. We never recognized that we had this, not because, I'm sort of repeating myself. This prevented us from recognizing something else. Now here's a quote by Bob at the bottom. I am going to lead the world to real happiness and peace by making mankind more introspective and see more to the inside of things than what we had hitherto been accustomed to. So we're going to look within ourselves, I believe, for causes. Okay? That is where we will excavate, like archaeologists, the relics of our own perceptual evolution. That's where science is going to go. All this quantum mechanics and everything is a misunderstanding. They're inventing things that don't really explain anything. They're not realizing these are lenses. That's all that they have to understand. They can even quantify some of them. All right. The necessary thinking backward. The presence of something is evidence of its precondition. If something is there, that's a proof that its precondition exists. Okay. We'll understand this better. Look, Dan skips a stone. Looking backward in conditions is called retroduction, which I just explained. To see the color and sound of the stone skipping, we need a body and a nervous system. A body is a necessary precondition of seeing color and sound. It's not sufficient, but it's a necessary precondition. This in turn requires natural laws, for the body is none other than natural laws. Okay. So laws are a necessary precondition of a body. This in turn requires space. For how can one conceive of a law of motion that is not in space? So space is a necessary precondition of the law of natural laws. I'm doing this entirely by intuition, but it has to be true. And we can see it is. But logic won't tell you that, perception won't tell you that, induction won't tell you that. This in turn requires time. Can't have space without time. You can't perceive space without the ability to perceive time. You can't perceive spatially without the ability to perceive temporally. For spatiality can only be conceived in terms of time. For we can only distinguish one location from another by apprehending one point and then another. For if we did both at the same time, it would be one point. That sounds strange, but that's actually true. We must sequentially, in time, register and discern between here and then there to talk about a distance. I can't do them at the same time and have any idea of what. So there has to be a span of time. Thus, time is a necessary precondition of space. Number, likewise, is an immediately, it is immediate consequence of perceiving temporally. I forget the likewise. I added that. Number is an immediate consequence of perceiving in terms of time. For number is formless and considered sequentially and is an automatic consequence of time. Time is a necessary precondition of number. That's not original. That comes from Immanuel Kant. And Kant believed that you had different things that were possible because of these lenses of space and time, which he called intuitions, by the way, but intuition of space, intuition of time. Because we all know what time is, but we don't know how we know. Because we can't pick any up, put it in a jar, but we know. And then and you ask somebody, well, explain to me what time is. They always think, well, like a clock. They're just pointing to examples, kind of like they can't say what it is because, well, you just have to know. Okay, time is unnecessary. I kind of got off the subject. We need to be following these backward. This, in turn, requires distinction. Number, space, time require distinction. For the apprehension of time and number requires a sense of duality. Not duality, but the ability to discern, to be able to distinguish, to even be able to conceive of such a thing. Or the ability to distinguish. For one moment in time must be able to be demarcated from another. Thus, apprehension of duality is a necessary precondition of the apprehension of time. And to recognize a distinction, one must have the ability to imagine and recognize what one has imagined. And this is the same thing as consciousness. So consciousness is the necessary condition. So the ability to be conscious is the necessary precondition of imagination, apprehension, and all that falls out of them just named. If I might do this very briefly, so this would amount to saying, without doing it, for this lens to appear, this must appear first. For this lens to appear, this lens must appear first. For this, etc. And then finally, consciousness is necessary. But there's a precondition for consciousness. Okay? Now, in 2004, I thought, well, this is kind of odd because it seems like God is perception. But that doesn't feel right. I mean, God is like, is God love? You know, it's just, I couldn't work that, but it worked. But it said, but it was another 15 years before it occurred. There's a precondition to perception. Okay? Remember that God exists before the will. He wasn't perceiving anything. He wasn't even conscious. So God is not consciousness. We learned from Baba. God is not perception. God is the precondition. And what is that precondition? And this is where this intuition has led us backward, right to Baba, Baba's work. at the highest level of his words. Now the first cause, did I skip one? No, I didn't. Now the first cause, the event that is responsible, must be a conscious act, and it must be a whimsical act, as only an act of pure whimsy has no previous cause. Now my hitting the dominoes, that's not an act of whimsy, that's a conditioned act. It's conditioned by my psychology. And all those were not spontaneous, they were all conditioned by the laws of nature. And thus we have qualities of whimsicality, imagination, apprehension, and the ability to perceive, which means take conscious experience of. This is the kind of wording Baba uses in the Infinite Intelligence, where this comes from, which I hadn't read in 2004. It hadn't come out till 2007. So, what one has imagined. So one must be able to consciously take experience of what one has imagined for this to have occurred. What has these qualities? Intelligence. That's what we mean by intelligence. If you don't have the capacity for imagination and for consciousness and for all these things, then there's no intelligence there. Okay? For without intelligence, there can be none of these. A newborn baby has intelligence before it opens its eyes. If it did not, it would not see. Even if that intelligence was not used prior to its opening its eyes. Baba uses that analogy in God Speaks to explain how God could have preceded consciousness, or even the potentiality of consciousness, or the apparent potential. Now remember the glass, because this is the last step. This is the glass, and through that, I see all things rosy, but I'm not rosy. That's rosy. In appearance, it appears rosy. I didn't change. Even my perception really didn't change. It just got conditioned by the glass. Well, God, as I said, or the unified perception, is not conditioned. Therefore, jumping over this, it is without limit. And Baba, in Infinite Intelligence, points out that the word, when we say something that doesn't have a limit, is called infinite. It has no limit. It's non-finite. So this intelligence, it's not because he's super smart, because he read a bunch of books. It's because he has nothing to limit his intelligence. Because he is the very source. And he precedes the lenses. Note that any intelligence precedes the lenses of its own imagination. Well, maybe I wrote that wrong. It's necessarily not limited by those lenses. For preceding them, in this sense, it does not fall into the scope of those conditioning lenses it imagines. That intelligence is thus without limit of any kind. It is unconditioned, hence entirely free and unbound. And I quote Baba, "To exercise a whim is always the mark of an independent nature, because it is whimsicality that always colors the independent nature." So this is what is independent. This is the cause. Okay. Baba, the original infinite whim of God as the cause. The cause. There's no cause in the world. That's just effects. It's all effect. The world is effect. There's only one cause. There's not a string of causes, as Saint Aquinas believed. And it is responsible for breaking the spell of the original divine sound sleep state of God, and the result, which is creation, is called the effect. Now, we have found that are in our own intuitions. We could never have guessed this, because this just doesn't work like that. Like I know, Bob Underwood told me he was in the Marines 2 days ago, and then as he was driving away, I noticed his front license plate said Marines. And I've known Bob for years. I'd never noticed that. So you kind of have to sort of, you have to read the masters a lot, and Baba, because Baba has this. Baba has developments that are either lost or are much further developed. And so you can't guess this. But once you have the clues, you can see the license plate. We know this by intuition. And so infinite intelligence is the necessary precondition of everything. And its first free act of impulsive imagination is the cause. Now, a couple, maybe I know it was talk 9 last week that I said, or maybe, yeah, I think it was. I said there are 14 things that a good idea has to have to be plausible. And we went over them. But we're going to go over them, and then I presented the idea, which I just completed. I don't have anything more to add except next week a few points I have to sort of fix, bring up a couple problems, explain them away, talk about some other things. But we're done. But so now we're going to look over those 14 things and see if we got every single one. It must provide a process by which the things in our experience arise in our experience, not merely a name of something with no further elucidation. In other words, it will solve the mind-body causal problem. How do we have experience? But it must do it through a process, not a thing. So we have provided that process. Next, no hypostasis, no theoretical occult thing to explain our experience, no mytheme, because they didn't work, and I spent a lot of time showing them they don't work. It must account for the public and private qualities of our experience, both the subjective and the objective. Otherwise, we fall into solipsism and relativism, which is the problem right now with New Age books. They don't have the objective. They think, and they do become relativistic. They don't have a way to do it. They're trying to give up on the objects and the matter and just be perception, but they don't have a system that can give you the objective and the subjective. They're not objectivists. We have to. Baba refers to the objective 20 times in the discourses. 20 times. Talk about the objective world, talk about objective experience. Baba is not a frou-frou. Okay, and then it has to be a monism, not a two-world dualism. And we have a monism, because we just have perception. And ways of seeing are not an addition, as I explained last week, to perception. Ways of riding a bicycle don't add to the riding. They're just ways. Okay. It must conform to our intuition that matter is what we perceive directly. Matter denotes the qualities we see, hear, smell, taste, and all that. Not representations of a second occult world. Occult meaning hidden here in the earlier sense. Now, I've already shown that we've done. And it must have one substance and principle to conform with Occam's razor, who I love the fact that Occam was a Franciscan friar. By the way, I said Copernicus was a Franciscan. That was a mistake. It was one of those Bacon. All right, and that one substance and principle is infinite intelligence and its imagined schemes. So we did that. We succeeded at having the ideal theory, because the ideal is you have I won't go into it. It's just one thing. And by the way, they're not even hypotheses. We don't hypothesize that we perceive. We know that. That's the one thing we cannot deny, actually. So there's no hypothesis at all. So by Occam's razor, we're like, how many hypothetical things you got? 0. 0? Yeah. The intelligence is not a hypothesis. nor that we see, a duck or a rabbit. That's not a hypothesis. That's something that's irrefutable. So we don't have any hypothesis. This isn't a theory anymore. It explains everything we can possibly experience. The physical, the subtle, and the mental. Or it would be not explain everything. The whole sum of all things. Accounts for and explains our intuition of 1 + 1 is 2. We already did that. Those are the lenses, the earlier lenses. Time itself can produce that. We can account for it. Conforms with natural and also our intuition of non-contradiction. Conforms with natural laws, thus harmonious with science. Obviously, the whole thing's made out of natural laws. This is a natural answer to the universe. The materialists say, yeah, but we want a natural explanation. Well, there's never was an explanation better than this, and they can't explain the natural laws, and I can. So I got a much more natural explanation than any materialist, atheist, reductionist, who thinks. And it explains our inborn expectations of patterns, correlations, and causes that make things like language possible, make everything possible, make a baby be able to learn. How come we're born with these? It's explained because it's an evolution and we are the product of that evolution. These are God's own expectations as it seeks itself. And then it conforms with our innate sense of something that transcends the world of appearances. That was something that's transcendental. And in this case, it's infinite intelligence, or God, or the oversoul, or the absolute, or whatever you want to call it. Brahma, the one, we have that. Positive moral consequences. Those we treat are our own self. What better reason is there to treat another living, sentient thing well? And then we could add to that, once we read Baba, karma, because Baba's also said from good to God. There's a lot of reasons, okay? We don't have the kind of consequences we got from materialism and relativism and all solipsism. We don't, and behaviorism, where they do vivisections on, dogs. No, we'll torture people and say it's not torture because I can't see it. So, no, those have disgusting consequences. This has real, genuine, ethical, virtuous fruit. Something that no one's even been cared about. They talk about explanatory power. Well, this has got that as far as theoretical virtues. This has got real virtue. This will make a person a virtuous person who really imbibed it. And if this became the world consensual lens through which we see, will be a better world. And then accounts for our use of the body and brain to perceive, which I've already discovered. Thus solves, well, you'll see in a moment. And then finally, it's in accord with the revelations of the saints and Baba. And we'll go over some of the saints next week. That's a big part of next week. Now, just one last thing, because this has been a subject throughout this entire series, was sort of the theme, the recurring theme, that big test, if you could solve. Nobody's ever been able to solve the mind-body problem. And the mind-body problem has 3 problems. And we've solved all 3. No one claims. It is an irrefutable fact, completely uncontroversial, that the mind-body problem still boggles science and philosophy. It's called the intractable problem, or the hard problem. You can look up in Wikipedia, the hard problem. The term was coined by David Chalmers, a philosopher of mind. Now, the 3 problems of the mind-body problem are the skeptical problem. How do I know? How do I compare my experience in my mind to the real tree in the external world? Well, we don't have that. That's the real tree. We don't have 2 trees. So we don't have that problem. That just goes away. This is the causal problem. Well, you got these brain states firing, and then they suddenly have experience, and that gets from A to B, but I don't get where that. So they say a miracle happens. They don't know. That's called the causal problem. What's causing us to be conscious? What's causing us to experience? Nobody can answer that. Not even the idealists can answer that. It is because well, I've already explained. And then finally, the mind-body interaction problem. That was a problem in Descartes, where he had a little thing that hung down in his head called the pineal gland, and then the soul wiggles it like a bell, and I said it was like Quasimodo in the tower, and then that moves your body. And then the soul, which was immaterial, when a signal came in, the pineal gland tilted and it could feel that. I mean, that was when they realized they had a problem. Okay, we don't understand the connection between the body and the mind. How is it that the mind thoughts make us act? How is it that actions make us act? In ours, we explain. We'll explain more next week. How our individual selves associate and operate our body. We'll talk about it a little more next week. But here we have an actual mind-body interaction, which I'll explain more. And that's the conclusion of Talk 10. And next week, we will give final points, additional quotes by the ancient masters, and some warnings to future generations about these topics that I think are very important. And that will conclude Baba and the Future. Shape.